The evening sun cast long shadows across the polished floors of the Blue Water restaurant as Amelia Johnson hurried through the kitchen doors, tying her black apron around her waist. She was running 10 minutes late, a rarity for her, because her music theory professor had kept the class overtime to discuss their upcoming projects. "Sorry, I'm late." "Rosa," Amelia said to the head waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, who had taken Amelia under her wing when she first started working at the upscale establishment 2 years ago. "It's fine, honey, but you'd better get moving. Table 7 needs water refills and Mr. Peterson at the bar wants another whiskey." Rosa handed her a small notepad. "And heads up, the Reynolds party is coming in at 8. 12 people." Amelia nodded, feeling a flutter of anxiety. Everyone on staff knew about Maxwell Reynolds, the real estate tycoon whose name appeared regularly in business magazines and local newspapers. His buildings dominated the city skyline, and his reputation for being difficult preceded him. He tipped well but demanded perfection, and wasn't shy about making his displeasure known when things weren't exactly to his liking. "Got it," Amelia said, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear before grabbing a water pitcher. As she moved through the dining room, Amelia fell into the familiar rhythm of service, refilling glasses, taking orders, delivering plates with practiced grace. The work wasn't glamorous, but it paid her bills and, more importantly, her tuition at the Harmon School of Music where she studied piano composition. Most nights she didn't mind the work. She liked observing people, catching snippets of their conversations, imagining their lives beyond these meals. These observations often inspired her music, the quiet dignity of an elderly couple who held hands across the table, or the nervous energy of a first date unfolding at the corner table. Tonight, however, her mind kept drifting to the half-finished composition waiting for her at home. The deadline for the Westbrook Fellowship was only 3 weeks away, and between classes and double shifts, she barely had time to complete it. But she needed that fellowship. Unlike many of her classmates whose parents paid their way, Amelia was on her own. Her grandmother, who had raised her after her parents died, had sacrificed everything to pay for her early music lessons, believing wholeheartedly in her talent. When her grandmother passed away 2 years ago, Amelia had promised herself she wouldn't waste that sacrifice. At precisely 8 o'clock, the maitre d' approached her with a tight smile. "The Reynolds party has arrived. They're being seated in the private section. Thomas was supposed to take that section, but he just called in sick." "You're taking his tables?" Amelia's heart sank. The private section meant high expectations and a more demanding level of service. "All of them?" "I already have 6 tables in the main dining room. Don't worry, we'll redistribute. Jackson will take 4 of yours." The maitre d' lowered his voice. "Just be careful with Reynolds. The owner wants everything perfect. They're celebrating some big land deal." Amelia took a deep breath, centering herself the way she did before piano recitals. "I've got this." The private dining area occupied the restaurant's east wing, dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights. At its center stood a magnificent grand piano, a Steinway that the owner had purchased at auction, but that mostly remained untouched, except during weekend performances by hired musicians. Amelia often glanced at it longingly when she thought nobody was watching. The Reynolds party was already seated and talking loudly when she approached. Maxwell Reynolds himself sat at the head of the table, a large man in his early 60s with silver hair and an expensive suit that seemed slightly too tight across his shoulders. He was mid-story, gesturing broadly as his companions laughed. "Good evening," Amelia said with a warm smile. "Welcome to Blue Water. My name is Amelia, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." Reynolds barely glanced at her, continuing his conversation as she distributed menus. Only when she began explaining the evening's specials did he turn his attention to her, his eyes moving over her in a way that made her want to disappear. "We'll start with 2 bottles of the Chateau Margaux 2015, he said, interrupting her description of the sea bass special. "And tell the chef we expect excellence tonight." "We're celebrating." "Of course, sir. Congratulations on your celebration. I'll bring your wine right away." As the evening progressed, the volume at the Reynolds table grew steadily louder. 2 bottles of wine became 4, then 6. Their laughter became more raucous, their gestures more expansive. Amelia moved efficiently around them, invisibly replacing empty plates with full ones, ensuring glasses were never empty, adapting to their changing requests with practiced ease. She was clearing their dessert plates when she noticed Reynolds watching her again, this time with a calculating look that made her uncomfortable. She pretended not to notice, continuing her work with downcast eyes. "Hey, piano girl," he called suddenly, causing her to freeze. Amelia looked up, confused. She had never mentioned her musical studies to anyone at the restaurant except Rosa. "Yes, sir," she responded, keeping her voice professional despite her unease. Reynolds grinned, turning to include his companions in whatever was coming next. "Rosa tells me you're some kind of piano player, that you're studying at that fancy music school." Amelia made a mental note to have a word with Rosa later. She normally trusted her colleague's judgment, but this felt like a betrayal of her privacy. "I'm studying composition at Harmon," she answered simply. Hoping that would be the end of it, it wasn't. "Composition, huh?" Reynolds leaned back in his chair, swirling the remains of wine in his glass. The room had grown quieter, other diners at nearby tables glancing over with curious expressions. "So you can actually play that thing, then?" He nodded toward the grand piano. "I can, yes." Amelia began stacking plates, wanting to escape the sudden attention. One of Reynolds' associates, a thin man with a sharp face, chuckled. "Maybe she should play for us, Max. Give us a little entertainment." Reynolds' eyes lit up at the suggestion, his smile widening. "Now there's an idea. What do you say, piano girl? Show us what you've learned at that fancy school of yours." The request hung in the air like a challenge. Amelia could feel other staff members watching from the periphery, could sense the restaurant manager hovering nearby, unwilling to intervene with such an important customer but clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "I'm working right now, sir," Amelia said carefully, "but thank you for the interest in my studies." Reynolds' expression hardened slightly, though his smile remained fixed in place. "Come on now. We're celebrating, and I'm asking nicely." His tone suggested he wasn't used to being refused. "I'll make it worth your while. $100 if you can play something more complicated than chopsticks." One of the women at the table, a blonde in an expensive dress, giggled and whispered something to her companion. The room had grown uncomfortably silent now, all eyes on the interaction. Amelia stood completely still, the stack of plates in her hands suddenly feeling very heavy. The $100 would help with this month's electricity bill, which she was already worried about paying. But the mocking tone in Reynolds' voice made it clear this wasn't a genuine request for music. It was entertainment at her expense. She looked toward the manager, who avoided her gaze, then at Rosa, who stood by the service station with a pained expression. No help would come from either direction. This was the reality of service work. The customer was always right, especially when that customer spent thousands of dollars at the restaurant each month. "What's the matter?" Reynolds pressed, his voice carrying through the quiet dining room. "Stage fright? Or maybe you're not as talented as you claim to be." "I never claimed anything, sir," Amelia replied quietly, her heart pounding against her ribs. "So prove it then," he challenged, gesturing grandly toward the piano. "Or is it just a hobby you're wasting your tuition money on?" Something shifted in Amelia's chest, a spark of anger cutting through her embarrassment. She thought of her grandmother, who had cleaned houses 7 days a week to pay for her first piano lessons. She thought of the calluses on her own fingers from countless hours of practice. She thought of the half-finished composition on her desk at home that she poured her heart into during the precious few hours between work and sleep. Carefully, she set down the stack of plates on an empty table nearby. Without a word, she walked toward the piano, feeling dozens of eyes following her movement. The room seemed to hold its breath as she sat down on the bench, adjusted its height, and lifted the fallboard to reveal the gleaming keys beneath. Reynolds and his party watched with amused expressions, clearly expecting a brief fumbling attempt that would provide them with a good laugh to end their evening. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly know, was that in that moment, Amelia had stopped being a waitress. She placed her fingers on the keys, took a deep breath, and prepared to become who she truly was. Amelia's fingers hovered above the keys for just a moment. The restaurant had fallen so quiet she could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning system and the distant clink of glasses from the bar. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the familiar calm of performance settle over her. When she opened them again, she didn't see the dining room or the curious faces watching her. She saw only the piano, her oldest friend, her most faithful companion through every hardship. She began to play. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the space. Deep, resonant chords that seemed to vibrate through the polished wooden floors. It was a piece she had practiced hundreds of times, one that moved from darkness into light, from struggle into triumph. The music built slowly at first, like a story being carefully told, then grew in complexity and emotion. At table 7, a fork slipped from someone's hand and clattered against a plate, but no one turned to look. Every eye remained fixed on Amelia, whose transformation was astonishing. Gone was the quiet, deferential server who had been invisible to most of them minutes before. In her place sat an artist, her body swaying slightly with the music, her fingers dancing across the keys with practiced precision. Maxwell Reynolds sat frozen, the mocking smile slipping from his face as the music continued. This was clearly no amateur performance, no fumbling attempt worthy of his ridicule. The woman before him played with the confidence and skill of someone who had dedicated thousands of hours to her craft. Behind the bar, Rosa watched with tears gathering in her eyes. She had known Amelia was studying music but had never heard her play. When Reynolds had mentioned it earlier, having overheard Rosa talking to the chef about her young colleague's studies, she had immediately regretted the slip. Now watching Amelia command the room with her talent, Rosa felt a complex mixture of pride and shame. The music flowed through the restaurant like a living thing. The piece was known for its emotional range, melancholy giving way to hope, restraint blossoming into passionate expression. Amelia played it all, her technique flawless but secondary to the feeling she poured into every note. This wasn't just demonstration. This was communication in its purest form. In the kitchen, the staff had stopped working. Cooks and dishwashers stood in the doorway, watching in amazement. The maitre d', who had been so concerned about keeping Reynolds happy, now stood with his hand over his mouth, utterly transfixed. An elderly couple seated near the windows held hands across their table. The woman's eyes closed as she listened. A businessman dining alone had set down his phone, the first time he'd done so all evening, and sat back in his chair, a distant look on his face as if the music was taking him somewhere far away. For Amelia, the world had narrowed to just her hands and the keyboard. She had always been most herself when playing, most honest, most present. Each note was both an escape and a homecoming. She thought of her grandmother, who had recognized her gift when she was just 4 years old, sitting on her lap and picking out melodies on an old upright piano. She thought of the countless evenings spent practicing instead of playing with friends, the early mornings before school, the scholarships that had finally made her dream of music school possible. And somewhere in the middle of it all, her embarrassment and anger transformed into something else, a quiet certainty, a knowledge of her own worth that had nothing to do with serving meals or earning tips or enduring the casual disrespect of men like Maxwell Reynolds. As the piece reached its most technically demanding section, Amelia leaned into the challenge, her hands moving with precise grace. The rapid cascades of notes came alive under her touch, each one clear and intentional. The music surged and retreated, telling its story without words, filling the room with emotion that needed no translation. At the Reynolds table, the atmosphere had completely shifted. The boisterous celebration had given way to stunned silence. One of the women dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. The sharp-faced man who had suggested the performance now looked uncomfortable, avoiding Reynolds's gaze. And Reynolds himself sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable as he watched Amelia play. The restaurant manager stood by the host station, his earlier anxiety replaced by wonder. He had worked at Blue Water for 15 years and had hired many professional musicians to perform on that very piano. Few had commanded it with such skill and emotion as this young woman, who had been invisibly serving meals all around them for 2 years. As Amelia approached the final movement, she felt a sense of both power and peace. For these minutes, she wasn't someone to be dismissed or overlooked. She wasn't defined by her uniform or her job title. She was exactly who she had always been, a musician speaking through her art. The concluding notes of the piece rang out, clear and resolute. Amelia's hands finally stilled above the keys, allowing the last chord to resonate through the room before slowly lifting the sustain pedal. For several seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. The silence was as complete as it had been when she started playing. Then, from a table near the window, the elderly woman began to applaud. Her husband joined immediately after, rising to his feet. Like a wave, The applause spread through the dining room, growing in volume until it filled the space that moments ago had been occupied by music. People stood from their tables, faces shining with genuine appreciation. Amelia remained seated for a moment, slightly dazed by the transition back to reality. She hadn't played for an audience this size since her last recital at school. She certainly hadn't expected to perform tonight in her work uniform, with dirty dishes waiting to be cleared. She rose from the bench and gave a small, graceful bow, a habit ingrained from years of recitals. As she straightened, she finally allowed herself to look directly at the Reynolds table. The expressions there varied widely. Some looked impressed, others embarrassed. A few seemed to be avoiding eye contact altogether. And Reynolds, the man who had intended to humiliate her, sat with an expression that seemed caught between surprise and something that might have been shame. As Amelia turned to return to her duties, Reynolds stood up suddenly. "Wait," he called out, his voice lacking its earlier arrogance. The restaurant fell quiet again as he approached her. Up close, he seemed somehow smaller than he had at the table, less certain. "That was," he began, then paused, apparently searching for words. "That was extraordinary. Where did you learn to play like that?" Amelia met his gaze steadily. "I've been playing since I was 4. I'm completing my master's in music composition at Harmon." Reynolds nodded slowly, a flicker of genuine respect crossing his features. "I promised you $100. He reached for his wallet. Amelia shook her head. "Keep it. I didn't play for your money." The simplicity of her refusal seemed to affect him more than any angry response could have. He stood awkwardly for a moment, wallet in hand, apparently unsure how to proceed. "Well," he said finally, closing the wallet and returning it to his pocket. "Thank you for the performance." As he turned to walk back to his table, a woman rose from one of the other dining tables, a dignified figure in her 50s with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in an elegant knot. She approached Amelia with purposeful steps. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Amelia couldn't quite place. "My name is Elena Vartanian. I'm on the board of the Symphony Foundation." She extended a business card. "We should talk about your future." Amelia accepted the card automatically. Reading the embossed letters, "Elena Vartanian, Director, Symphony Foundation." Below that was a phone number and email address. "Call me tomorrow," Elena said. "Talent like yours deserves recognition." As Elena returned to her table, Amelia stood holding the card, feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. She tucked the card carefully into her apron pocket and turned toward the kitchen, only to find Rosa standing nearby, her eyes shining with tears and pride. "I'm so sorry," Rosa whispered. "I never meant for him to—" "It's okay," Amelia interrupted gently. "Really?" The restaurant had begun to return to normal, conversations resuming, servers moving between tables, the regular rhythm of the evening continuing. But something fundamental had changed. As Amelia moved through the dining room, guests who had never before made eye contact now smiled at her or nodded in acknowledgement. A table that had been demanding and impatient earlier now thanked her warmly when she brought their check. And at table 7, Maxwell Reynolds watched her with a thoughtful expression that contained neither the earlier mockery nor the momentary shame, but something more complex. Perhaps the first stirrings of a reckoning with his own assumptions and the casual cruelty they had inspired. For Amelia, walking through the restaurant felt different too. Her steps were lighter, her posture more confident. The card in her pocket felt like a promise, not just of a potential opportunity, but of a world in which her true self might finally be seen and valued. As she pushed through the kitchen doors, ready to finish her shift with the same professionalism she'd always shown, Amelia realized that regardless of what came from Elena Vartanian's card, something important had already happened. She had been reminded of her own worth, not as others defined it, but as she herself knew it to be. Amelia woke before her alarm the next morning, the events of the previous night still vivid in her mind. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of her small apartment, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air. For a moment, she wondered if she had dreamed it all. The piano, the applause, the business card. She reached for her work apron draped over a chair and pulled out the card. It was real, the embossed letters catching the light. Elena Vartanian, Director, Symphony Foundation. Sitting up in bed, Amelia traced her finger over the raised lettering. The Symphony Foundation was one of the most prestigious arts organizations in the city. They funded scholarships, hosted concerts, and supported musicians at all stages of their careers. Having any connection there would be valuable, but having the interest of a board director was beyond anything she had imagined possible. Her phone showed 7:15 a.m., too early to make a professional call. She had the day off from the restaurant but still had classes in the afternoon. Nervous energy propelled her out of bed and to her small upright piano in the corner of her living room, the only furniture besides a second-hand couch and a coffee table. It wasn't a magnificent Steinway like the one at the restaurant, but it was hers, bought with her grandmother's life insurance money, the one thing she had insisted on keeping even when rent was tight. She played through some warm-up exercises, then began working on her composition for the Westbrook Fellowship. The piece had been giving her trouble for weeks, but this morning her fingers moved with new confidence. The music flowed more naturally, as if the previous night's performance had broken through some invisible barrier. At precisely 9:30 a.m., she picked up her phone and dialed the number on Elena's card, her heart thumping against her ribs. "Elena Vartanian speaking," came the answer after 2 rings. "Hello, Ms. Vartanian. This is Amelia Johnson. We met last night at Blue Water Restaurant after I played the piano." "Amelia, yes, of course. I'm so glad you called." Elena's voice warmed considerably. "Your performance was remarkable. Rachmaninoff is not for the faint of heart, and you played with such emotion and technical precision." "Thank you," Amelia replied, unused to such direct praise. "It was unexpected. I don't usually perform at work." A small laugh came through the phone. "I gathered that, which makes it all the more impressive. Listen, I have a proposition for you. The foundation is hosting a fundraising gala next month. We typically feature young talent, and I'd like you to perform." Amelia sat down on the edge of her couch, stunned. "You want me to play at the Symphony Foundation gala?" "Yes, it would be a 10-minute slot. You could play the Rachmaninoff again or something else of your choosing. The audience will include many of our donors and board members. And that's an incredible opportunity." "Yes, I'd love to." "Excellent. There's one more thing. You mentioned to Mr. Reynolds that you're studying composition. Do you have any original pieces?" Amelia glanced at the sheet music spread across her piano. "Yes, I'm actually working on one now for a fellowship application. Would you consider playing that instead? The foundation has a particular interest in supporting new composers." The request caught Amelia off guard. Her composition was personal, drawn from her experiences, her struggles. The idea of performing it in front of an audience of wealthy arts patrons was intimidating, but it was also exactly the kind of opportunity she had been working toward. "It would be an honor," she said finally, "though it's still in progress." "Perfect. Complete it and we'll put you on the program. I'll email you the details later today." "And Amelia, I'm very much looking forward to hearing your voice as a composer." After hanging up, Amelia sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Then as the reality sank in, she jumped up and spun around her small apartment, letting out a whoop of joy that probably startled her neighbors. This was it, a real chance to be heard, to have her music taken seriously by people who could open doors in her field. She called her closest friend Dahlia, nearly incoherent with excitement as she explained what had happened at the restaurant and the subsequent invitation. Wait, Dahlia interrupted. "You're telling me that some rich jerk tried to humiliate you and instead you ended up with a gig at the Symphony Foundation gala? That's like the music world's version of a Cinderella story." "I know it sounds crazy," Amelia laughed. "I'm still trying to process it myself." "Well, you deserve it. You've been working toward this for years." Dahlia's voice softened. "Your grandma would be so proud." Amelia felt tears prick at her eyes. "I wish she could be there. She will be in your music." Over the next 3 weeks, Amelia threw herself into completing her composition with renewed purpose. When she wasn't in class or at work, where customers now sometimes requested that she play, a request the owner was happy to grant, having seen the positive response, she was at her piano, refining and polishing her piece. The composition had begun as her application for the Westbrook Fellowship, but it had evolved into something more personal. She called it Scene, a musical exploration of invisibility and recognition, themes that had gained new meaning since that night with Reynolds. The piece moved between quiet, introspective sections and bold, assertive passages, telling a story without words that she hoped would resonate with listeners. 2 days before the gala, Amelia received another unexpected call. It was the restaurant manager. "Amelia, I have a somewhat awkward situation," he began. Maxwell Reynolds called. "He's asking if you'll be working this Friday evening." She frowned, unsure what to make of this. "No, I swapped shifts to prepare for a performance." "Why?" "He says he wants to apologize in person. I told him I'd check with you first before giving him any information about your schedule." Amelia was surprised by both Reynolds' request and her manager's newfound respect for her boundaries. "What exactly did he say?" "That he behaved poorly and would like to make amends." He sounded sincere, for what it's worth. She considered for a moment. "Tell him I appreciate the sentiment, but I'm preparing for a performance at the Symphony Foundation Gala. If he wants to apologize, he can make a donation to their educational programs instead." The manager chuckled. "I'll pass that along." What Amelia didn't expect was that Reynolds would take her suggestion literally. The following afternoon, she received an email from Elena Vartanian. "Amelia, I thought you'd like to know that we've received a substantial donation to our youth music education program from Maxwell Reynolds. His assistant mentioned it was at your suggestion. Whatever influence you have over him, it's being put to good use. The funds will support piano lessons for 20 children from low-income neighborhoods for a full year. Looking forward to your performance tomorrow evening. Best, Elena." Attached to the email was the final program for the gala. There, listed among established musicians and guest speakers, was her name: Amelia Johnson, pianist and composer, Scene, world premiere. The evening of the gala arrived with a flurry of nerves and excitement. The symphony hall glittered with elegant decorations, the crowd a sea of formal attire and polite conversation. Amelia, dressed in a simple black dress borrowed from Dahlia, waited backstage, trying to calm her racing heart. From her position behind the curtain, she could see Elena mingling with guests in the lobby. And there, to her surprise, stood Maxwell Reynolds in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, speaking with a small group of patrons. He looked different somehow, less imposing, more human. A stagehand approached with a 5-minute warning. Amelia closed her eyes and took a deep breath, centering herself the way her first piano teacher had taught her. She thought of her grandmother, of the journey that had brought her here, of all the hours spent practicing when friends were out having fun, of the double shifts and tired fingers and moments of doubt. Then her name was announced, and she walked onto the stage to polite applause. The lights were bright, the grand piano at center stage gleaming under the spotlights. She took her seat at the bench, adjusted it slightly, and looked out over the audience. In that moment of silence before she began to play, she caught Reynolds' eye in the third row. He gave her a small, respectful nod. Amelia turned to the piano, placed her hands on the keys, and began to play her composition. The opening notes were quiet, tentative, like someone used to being overlooked. But as the piece progressed, the melody grew stronger, more confident, building to moments of surprising power and clarity, before resolving into a final section that was neither meek nor aggressive, but simply, authentically present. As the last notes faded, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the audience erupted in applause, rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Amelia stood and bowed, her heart full, her vision slightly blurred with tears. In that moment, she wasn't just being seen, she was being heard. And that, she realized, was what she had wanted all along. When she walked off stage, Elena was waiting with a wide smile. "That was extraordinary, Amelia. Truly original and moving. Thank you," Amelia said, still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of performance. "There are several people who want to meet you at the reception. Directors from the conservatory, some of our donors, and a representative from Carlton Recording Studios." Amelia nodded, trying to absorb what this meant. "I'll be there shortly. I just need a moment." Alone in the green room, she sat down and took a deep breath, allowing herself to fully experience the gravity of what had just happened. Her music, her voice, had been heard in Symphony Hall. Whatever came next, this moment could never be taken away from her. The reception following the gala buzzed with conversation and the gentle clinking of champagne glasses. Amelia stood near a pillar, slightly overwhelmed as person after person approached to compliment her performance. Each time she thanked them politely, still not quite believing that these influential figures in the music world were talking about her composition with such enthusiasm. There she is, Elena's voice cut through the crowd as she approached with an elderly man whose posture suggested years of conducting. "Philip, this is Amelia Johnson, our remarkable discovery. Amelia, meet Philip Castleton, director of the State Conservatory." Amelia extended her hand, trying to hide her shock. The State Conservatory was one of the most prestigious music institutions in the country. "That was quite a piece, young woman," Castleton said, his handshake firm despite his age. "Technically impressive, but more importantly, it had something to say. Too many young composers focus on technique and forget about communication. Thank you, sir. That means a great deal coming from you. I understand you're completing your master's at Harmon." "Yes, in composition. I'll graduate this spring." Castleton nodded thoughtfully. "The conservatory is launching a new fellowship program for emerging composers. 3 years of funding, performance opportunities, and mentorship. The application deadline is next month. I'd encourage you to apply." He handed her a small card. "My direct email. Send me your portfolio when you're ready." As Castleton moved away to greet other guests, Amelia turned to Elena with wide eyes. "Did that just happen?" Elena laughed. "It did. And he doesn't give out his card to just anyone." She guided Amelia through the crowd. "There's someone else who's been waiting to speak with you." To Amelia's surprise, Elena led her to where Maxwell Reynolds stood somewhat awkwardly by himself, looking out of place despite his expensive tuxedo. When he saw them approaching, he straightened. "Ms. Johnson," he said with a formality that contrasted sharply with their first encounter. "Your performance was extraordinary." "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds." Elena glanced between them. "I'll leave you two to chat. Amelia, don't forget to speak with the Carlton recording representative before you leave." When they were alone, an uncomfortable silence fell. Reynolds cleared his throat. "I want to apologize for my behavior at the restaurant. It was inexcusable." Amelia studied his face, searching for the arrogance she had seen that night. Instead, she found what appeared to be genuine discomfort and regret. "I appreciate that," she said finally. "I also want to thank you." This caught her off guard. "Thank me? For what?" Reynolds looked down at his glass. "Your suggestion about donating to the Foundation's education program was illuminating. My own daughter studied piano as a child but gave it up because I never took it seriously. I treated it as a hobby, not a legitimate pursuit." He paused. "Watching you play made me wonder what she might have become if I had been more supportive." The revelation of this personal regret surprised Amelia. She had imagined Reynolds as someone incapable of self-reflection. "It's never too late to change how we see things," she offered. He nodded slowly. "The donation was a start. I've also established a scholarship at Harmon for students working while pursuing music degrees. Your dean tells me they'll announce it next semester." Amelia was speechless. The scholarship would help students exactly like her, talented but without financial support. "That's incredibly generous. It's the least I can do." Reynolds hesitated. "I've spent my life building things, concrete things you can see and touch. I never really understood the value of what you do until I heard you play. It made me reconsider some assumptions I've carried for a long time." Before Amelia could respond, a woman approached them, tall and elegant, with a resemblance to Reynolds that suggested a family connection. "Dad, they're asking for major donors for a photo," she said, then turned to Amelia with a warm smile. "You must be Amelia. Your piece was beautiful. I'm Valerie, Maxwell's daughter." "It's nice to meet you," Amelia replied, connecting the dots to the daughter Reynolds had mentioned. "I studied piano until college," Valerie continued. "Hearing you play makes me wish I'd stuck with it." "It's never too late to return to it," Amelia suggested. Valerie's smile widened. "That's what I keep telling myself. I actually started lessons again last month." She glanced at her father. "Dad's been surprisingly supportive this time around." Reynolds looked slightly embarrassed. "We should go for that photo," he said to his daughter, then turned back to Amelia. "Congratulations again on your success tonight. It was well deserved." As they walked away, Amelia watched them with a sense of wonder. The man who had tried to humiliate her had not only apologized but had taken concrete actions that would help others like her. People could change, it seemed, when confronted with their own misconceptions. The evening continued with more introductions, more handshakes, more business cards exchanged. By the time Amelia finally left Symphony Hall, her small purse was filled with cards from people who wanted to hear more of her music, who offered opportunities she had only dreamed of before. Outside, the cool night air was a relief after the warm, crowded reception. Amelia took a deep breath, looking up at the stars barely visible through the city lights. She thought about calling a ride, then decided to walk a few blocks first to clear her head. As she passed the restaurant where she still would need to work, at least until some of these opportunities materialized into actual income, she paused. Through the window, she could see the piano where this journey had begun just weeks ago. It stood silent now, the restaurant closed for the night. But she could almost hear the music still, could almost feel the moment when everything had changed. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dahlia. "How did it go? Call me when you're done." With a smile, Amelia dialed her friend's number. "You won't believe the night I've had," she said when Dahlia answered. "Tell me everything." "Wait, are you still there? It's so late." "Just left. I'm walking home. Or at least partway home. And? How was the performance? Were you nervous? Did people like it?" Amelia laughed at the rapid-fire questions. "The performance went well." "Yes, I was terrified. And yes, people seemed to really connect with the piece. I told you they would. Your music is special, Amelia. I've been saying that since freshman year." "Well, apparently Philip Castleton agrees with you. He wants me to apply for a fellowship at the conservatory." Dahlia's squeal of excitement was so loud that Amelia had to hold the phone away from her ear. "The Philip Castleton? The conservatory? Amelia, that's huge, I know. It doesn't feel real yet." Amelia paused at a street corner, waiting for the light to change. And that's not all. Reynolds was there. The jerk from the restaurant? Why?
He made a donation to the Foundation's education program.
And he's funding a scholarship at Harmon for working music students. A thoughtful silence followed.
"Wow, so your playing actually changed him?"
"I think it made him question some things about himself, about how he sees the world and the people in it." Amelia crossed the street, her steps lighter than they had been in years. His daughter was there too. She started playing piano again, apparently because of what happened that night. "See, your music doesn't just sound beautiful, it changes things. It changes people." The simple observation struck Amelia deeply. Isn't that what she had always hoped for, beyond recognition or success? To create music that mattered, that moved people, that perhaps even helped them see the world differently? "Maybe it does," she agreed softly. By the time she reached her apartment building, they had talked through every detail of the evening, every conversation, every possibility that had opened before her. Dahlia's excitement was contagious, helping Amelia fully appreciate the significance of what had happened. "Get some sleep," Dahlia said finally. "Tomorrow we're celebrating properly. Brunch at my place. I want to hear your piece too. The whole thing, not just the parts you've shown me." "Deal," Amelia agreed, unlocking her door. "Good night, Dahlia, and thanks for being there through all of this, always. That's what friends are for." Inside her small apartment, Amelia kicked off her shoes and sat at her piano. Despite the late hour and the exhaustion beginning to set in, her fingers found the keys, playing softly so as not to disturb her neighbors. She played a few notes from her composition, then let it evolve into something new, the beginnings of another piece. Perhaps inspired by the evening's events as she played, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, about her grandmother's sacrifice and belief in her talent, about the years of hard work and doubt, about a moment of intended humiliation that had transformed into opportunity. Most of all, she thought about being truly seen and heard, not just by the influential people at the gala, but by herself. Somewhere along the way, amid the struggling and the striving, she had begun to doubt her own voice, to question whether her music truly mattered. Tonight had reminded her that it did. The new melody took shape under her fingers, hopeful but grounded, acknowledging struggle while looking forward. It wasn't finished, not yet, but neither was her story. When she finally went to bed, Amelia slept more peacefully than she had in years. The weight of uncertainty lifted, if not entirely, then enough to let her breathe more freely. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new music, but tonight, in this moment, she had been heard. And that was, 6 months had passed since the Symphony Foundation Gala, and spring sunshine streamed through the windows of Amelia's new apartment. It wasn't large, a one-bedroom with a small balcony, but it was a significant upgrade from her previous place. Most importantly, it had room for her piano and better acoustics for practicing. She stood by the window, coffee mug in hand, watching people on the street below. Today was a milestone, her final day at Blue Water Restaurant. After years of juggling work and studies, she was finally able to focus solely on music. The conservatory fellowship had come through 3 months ago. Philip Castleton had personally called to give her the news, and she'd nearly dropped the phone in shock. The stipend wasn't lavish, but combined with the part-time teaching position Elena had helped her secure at the community music school, it was enough to live on without waiting tables. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dahlia. "Ready for your last shift? Don't forget we're celebrating after." Amelia smiled and texted back, "As ready as I'll ever be. See you tonight." She dressed for work, no longer feeling the same dread that had once accompanied donning the uniform. The restaurant had changed for her after that night at the piano. The owner had asked her to play occasionally for special events, paying her properly for performances. Customers sometimes requested her, not as a server but as the pianist they'd heard about through word of mouth. Even her co-workers treated her differently, not because they valued her more now that others did, but because they'd seen a side of her they hadn't known existed. When she arrived for her final shift, Rosa was waiting with a warm hug. "I can't believe you're really leaving us," the older woman said, her eyes a bit misty, "though I always knew you would." "I'll come back to visit," Amelia promised. "And you're coming to my first conservatory showcase next month, right? I left tickets for you and your husband at will call. Wouldn't miss it for anything," Rosa assured her. "Now go on, they're waiting for you." "Who's waiting?" Rosa just smiled mysteriously and gestured toward the private dining room. Confused, Amelia made her way there, expecting perhaps a small gathering of co-workers. What she found instead left her momentarily speechless. The room was filled with people, her colleagues from the restaurant, yes, but also Elena, and several other Foundation board members, some of her professors from Harmon, even Philip Castleton. At the center of the room stood the restaurant owner beside a cake decorated with musical notes. And there, somewhat awkwardly to one side, was Maxwell Reynolds with his daughter Valerie. "Surprise," they called as she entered. The owner stepped forward with a broad smile. "We couldn't let our resident musical genius leave without a proper send-off." I don't know what to say," Amelia stammered, genuinely moved. "Thank you all for coming." "It was Valerie's idea, actually," the owner said, nodding toward Reynolds' daughter. Valerie approached with a warm smile. "I hope you don't mind. Dad and I wanted to wish you well, and when we mentioned it to Elena, it sort of grew." "I'm touched, truly," Amelia said, still taking in the unexpected gathering. For the next hour, she moved through the room accepting congratulations and well wishes. Her composition professor brought news that her piece Scene had been selected for inclusion in the university's annual showcase concert. Castleton introduced her to 2 other fellows who would be joining the program with her. The restaurant staff had pooled together to buy her a beautiful leather portfolio for her sheet music. When she finally made her way to Reynolds, he seemed more at ease than at the gala, though still not entirely comfortable. "Congratulations on the fellowship," he said. "Castleton tells me it's quite competitive." "Thank you." "And thank you for coming today?" Valerie insisted, he said with a glance toward his daughter, who was chatting animatedly with Dahlia across the room. "But I wanted to as well. I have some news you might find interesting." "Oh?" "The scholarship at Harmon has its first recipients. 5 students all working their way through music school like you did." He pulled out his phone and showed her a photo of 5 young people, their faces shining with the particular mix of relief and joy that comes from financial burden being lifted. "The dean says they're all extremely talented." Amelia studied the faces, remembering her own struggles and the constant worry about making ends meet while pursuing her passion. "This will change their lives," she said softly. "I hope so." Reynolds put away his phone. "I've also joined the board of the Symphony Foundation. Elena convinced me they needed more donors who actually understand the importance of music education." Amelia raised an eyebrow. "And do you understand it now?" A hint of his old confidence returned, but without the arrogance. "I'm learning. Valerie has been quite the teacher." His expression softened as he looked toward his daughter. "She's giving her first piano recital next month. Small venue, just friends and family, but she's nervous as hell. Pardon my language. Tell her it's okay to be nervous. It means she cares." Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. "I'll do that." He hesitated, then added, "She's playing one of your compositions, you know. The teaching piece you wrote for the community school." Her instructor thought it would be a good fit. This was news to Amelia. She had written several pieces for her beginning students but hadn't realized they were being used beyond her own classes. "I'm honored," she said, genuinely surprised. "The honor is ours," Reynolds replied with unexpected sincerity. Their conversation was interrupted as the owner called for everyone's attention. To Amelia's surprise, they had moved the piano from the main dining room into the private space. "Before we let Amelia go," he announced, "we've all agreed that we need one more performance. Amelia, would you play for us one last time in this restaurant?" A chorus of agreement rose from the gathered crowd. Amelia felt a blush rise to her cheeks but nodded her assent. As she made her way to the piano, she noticed Rosa wiping away a tear and felt her own eyes growing misty. She sat at the bench, adjusting it from habit, and considered what to play. The Rachmaninoff that had started everything? One of her own compositions? Neither felt quite right for this moment. Her fingers found the keys and began to play a piece she had been working on privately, one not yet performed for anyone. It had begun as an exercise, a musical thank you letter of sorts acknowledging the journey and the people who had been part of it. The melody was simple but layered with complexity beneath, much like life itself, she thought. As she played, she glanced around the room. There was Dahlia, her steadfast friend through years of struggle. Rosa, who had mothered her when she missed her grandmother most. Her professors who had pushed her to develop her talent. Elena, who had seen her potential and given her a platform. Even Reynolds, who had inadvertently set this entire journey in motion with what was meant to be an insult. The piece moved from tentative beginnings through moments of struggle and conflict, building toward a resolution that wasn't perfect but was deeply satisfying. Notes finding their proper places, dissonance resolving into harmony without losing complexity. When the final notes faded, there was that familiar moment of silence, the pause between music and reality that she had come to love. Then applause filled the room, genuine and warm. "What's it called?" Elena asked as Amelia rose from the bench. "Full Circle," she replied. It seemed fitting. After the party, when most guests had departed, Amelia changed out of her uniform for the last time. She folded it carefully, feeling a strange mix of emotions. This job had been a necessity, sometimes a burden, but also a constant in her life during years of uncertainty. Rosa found her in the break room, now dressed in her regular clothes, looking at the uniform on the table. "Hard to say goodbye?" the older woman asked. "A little. This place has been a bigger part of my life than I expected," Rosa smiled knowingly. "Places are just places. It's the people and experiences that matter." She wrapped an arm around Amelia's shoulders. "And those go with you." Outside, Dahlia was waiting with a group of friends to begin the evening's celebration. The spring air was warm, filled with the scent of new beginnings. "Ready for the next chapter?" Dahlia asked, linking arms with her. Amelia took one last look at the restaurant, remembering the night that had changed everything. She thought about the unlikely path that had brought her here, a path that included struggle and humiliation, but also triumph and recognition. Most importantly, it had brought her back to herself and her music. "More than ready," she replied, and stepped forward into the future she had worked so hard to create. Later that night, after celebrations with friends, Amelia returned to her apartment alone. She kicked off her shoes and sat at her piano, playing softly in the darkness. The melody of Full Circle came back to her fingers, but this time it extended beyond the ending she had played earlier, reaching toward something new, because that was the nature of music and of life. Each ending was just a pause before the next movement began. Each resolution opened the door to new questions, new explorations. As she played into the quiet hours of morning, Amelia felt a deep sense of gratitude for her grandmother's belief in her, for the hardships that had strengthened her resolve, for the moment of intended humiliation that had instead become a doorway to opportunity, for the people who had seen her, truly seen her along the way. Most of all, she felt grateful for her own persistence, for the quiet voice inside that had kept her going, even when the path seemed impossible. That voice, she now understood, was the source of her music, and it would guide her forward, wherever the journey led next. The final notes she played that night weren't an ending at all, but a beginning, open-ended, full of possibility, waiting to be continued.